I should have never gone on that trip. I should have listened to my gut and stayed home. Now, I'm the only one left. The others, they're gone, and I know it's still out there. It started as a simple camping trip. Me, and for privacy reasons, let's just say my friends are called Jake, Ryan, and Dylan. We had been friends for years, always up for an adventure. Dylan found this remote spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. No people, no distractions, just us and the wild, he had said. It sounded perfect at the time. We hiked in for a while, eventually setting up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, the wind whispering softly through the trees. As the sun set, we sat around the fire, joking, drinking, and reminiscing. It felt like old times. But then, as the fire burned low and the night grew still, we heard it. A child's cry. It was distant, just beyond the trees. A small, pitiful voice, barely audible. "Help, please, help me." We froze. My skin prickled, my stomach twisted. What the hell was a child doing this deep in the woods? Ryan stood up first. "Did you hear that?" Jake grabbed his flashlight. "That sounded like a kid, right?" Dylan frowned. "No way. It's the middle of nowhere." But then the voice came again, closer this time. A whimpering sob, like a child too weak to keep crying. Only it sounded exactly the same as last time. I felt sick. Something was wrong. Everything in me screamed, "Don't go." But Ryan was already heading toward the trees. Jake followed without hesitation. Dylan hesitated, glancing at me. "Dude, what if it's real?" he said. I shook my head. "It doesn't make sense. How would a kid get all the way out here?" The crying came again. Dylan cursed under his breath. "We can't just leave a kid out there." And just like that, I was alone. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, heart pounding. Minutes passed, then more. The woods were dead silent now. No voices, no footsteps, just emptiness. Then, snap, a twig breaking, close. I shot up, swinging my flashlight toward the trees. "Jake?" My voice came out shaky. "Ryan? Dylan?" Silence. Then movement, a shape emerging from the darkness. My heart leapt. Dylan! But something was wrong. He stood at the edge of the firelight, motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His clothes were torn. His arms hung limply at his sides. "Dylan?" I said. He took a slow step forward into the light. That's when I saw it. His eyes were wrong, dark, hollow, and his mouth was too wide, stretching in a way no human mouth should. Then he grinned. I stumbled backward, choking on my breath. My flashlight flickered. And then he spoke, not in his voice. It was the child's voice. "Help me, please." My body locked up in terror. That wasn't Dylan. That thing was wearing his skin. Then it moved, not walked, not ran. It jerked toward me inhumanly fast, limbs twitching, mouth still stretched in that grotesque grin. I ran. I didn't grab my bag. I didn't grab anything. I just ran, blindly crashing through the trees. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, branches snapping, something rustling through the leaves, keeping pace with me effortlessly. Then I heard something worse, laughter, not just one voice, 3. The voices of Jake, Ryan, and Dylan, all laughing, all speaking in perfect unison. "Why are you running?" I nearly tripped over my own feet, my vision blurred with panic. That thing wasn't just imitating a child, it had taken them. I don't think I've ever ran that fast before in my life. Somehow, I made it back to the car. I didn't think. I jumped in, locked the doors, and tore down the dirt road so fast I nearly lost control. I didn't stop driving until I saw streetlights. I called the police. Search teams went out. They found our campsite. The fire was still burning when they got there, but there was no trace of Jake, no trace of Ryan, no trace of Dylan. They never found them. I could never tell people the full story. They wouldn't believe me. It's been weeks now. I don't sleep anymore. When I close my eyes, I see Dylan's face. That grin, that thing. It has traumatized me for life. My boyfriend, let's call him Jason, always made me feel safe. He was big, strong, and had this quiet confidence about him that made me believe nothing could hurt us as long as he was around. So when he suggested a weekend camping trip near Blackwater Lake, I didn't hesitate. We arrived in the afternoon, setting up camp in a small clearing right by the water's edge. The lake was stunning, smooth as glass, reflecting the towering pines that lined its shore. We had the place to ourselves, and as the sun set, the world felt peaceful. Jason got a fire going while I unpacked our gear. We spent the evening roasting hot dogs, drinking beer, and laughing about dumb things we'd done in college. It was perfect. Then, just as the last light faded from the sky, we heard something in the trees, a rustling sound. Not the wind, not an animal. Jason sat up straight, his expression shifting. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. "Probably just an animal." But then, a voice called out, "Evening, campers!" I nearly jumped out of my skin. A man stepped into the firelight. He was tall and wiry, dressed in a faded forest ranger uniform. Something about him immediately set me on edge. His clothes were dirty, frayed at the edges, and his badge looked wrong, too dull, too worn. His face was strange, his eyes too wide, like he'd never blinked enough. Jason stood, subtly shifting between me and the man. "Hey, didn't think there were any rangers out here this late." The man smiled, but there was something off about it. "Just making my rounds. You folks are deep in the woods, lots of dangers out here at night." Jason didn't move. "We'll be careful." The man just stood there, too long, not speaking, just staring. Then finally, he nodded. "You two have a good night." He turned and disappeared into the trees. I waited until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore before whispering, "That guy was weird." Jason didn't take his eyes off the tree line. "I don't think he's a real ranger." A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" Jason hesitated. His uniform was wrong, and he wasn't carrying a radio. That was when I noticed something else. There had been no truck, no flashlight, no gear. He had just appeared. Jason saw the look on my face and forced a smile. "It's fine. We're fine. I'll stay up for a bit." I wanted to argue, but I was exhausted. I curled up in my sleeping bag while Jason sat by the fire staring into the dark. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, Jason was shaking me awake. "Shh," he whispered, hand clamped over my mouth. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Close. Jason reached for the hatchet we'd brought for chopping firewood. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give us away. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. Then the zipper moved. Jason lunged. The tent exploded in chaos. The man was inside, hunched over us, a glint of metal in his hand, a knife. Jason tackled him, sending them both sprawling onto the ground outside. I scrambled out of the tent just in time to see Jason slam the man into the dirt, wrenching the knife from his grip. But the man was fast, too fast. He slipped out from under Jason and laughed. That's when I saw his teeth. They were filed down to points. He wasn't just some creep. he was something else. Jason didn't hesitate. He grabbed the knife and drove it into the man's shoulder. The man let out a horrible, wet scream, but didn't fall. He just grinned. Jason yanked me to my feet. "Get in the car, now!" I sprinted through the trees, branches whipping against my skin. Behind me, I could hear Jason and the man still struggling. I didn't stop. I threw myself into the truck, fumbling with the keys. Jason barreled out of the darkness, blood running down his arm. He jumped in, slamming the door. The headlights lit up the trees. The man stood just at the edge of the light, watching us, still grinning. Then he waved. I gunned the engine, and we tore down the dirt road, not stopping until we reached the highway. We went straight to the nearest ranger station. They sent a team to check the site. They didn't find him, but they did find something else. A shallow pit, covered in branches. Inside it, a pile of bones. Human bones. They said it looked like it had been used recently. We never went camping again. Boris and I had been friends since high school. He was a giant of a man, 6 feet 5 inches, built like a bulldozer, and strong enough to lift a grown man off the ground without breaking a sweat. Despite his intimidating size, he was the kindest person I knew. We'd spent our teenage years getting into all kinds of trouble, but life had taken us in different directions. When he suggested a weekend camping trip to relive old times, I jumped at the chance. We drove deep into the woods, past where the roads turned into dirt trails. The plan was simple: hike a few miles in, set up camp, and spend the weekend reminiscing. As the sun dipped behind the trees, we pitched our tent near a quiet, secluded clearing. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and a gentle breeze rustled the branches above. As night fell, we sat around the fire, cracking open a couple of beers and swapping stories. Remember that time we tried to break into the old school at night, and you got stuck in the window? Boris chuckled, his deep voice echoing in the darkness. I laughed, shaking my head. "Yeah, and you had to pull me out. You nearly ripped my pants off." The laughter faded, and we sat in a comfortable silence, staring at the flames. The only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle in the bushes. Then something changed. The forest around us grew unnervingly quiet. The insects stopped chirping. The wind died down. The only sound was the crackling fire between us. Boris frowned and turned his head slightly. "You hear that?" I strained my ears. At first, I heard nothing, but then soft, deliberate footsteps in the distance. Not the random rustling of a small animal, but the slow, measured steps of something watching us. My voice trembled. "Probably just a deer." Boris didn't look convinced. He reached for his flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the skeletal branches swaying in the dim light. But there was nothing there. A few minutes passed, and the noises stopped. The unease lingered, but we brushed it off, blaming our overactive imaginations. We eventually crawled into the tent, zipping ourselves inside for the night. I woke up sometime after midnight, heart hammering. Something was off. The tent was silent, but there was a presence, a suffocating weight pressing down on the air. Then I heard it, a whisper, not from outside the tent, but inside. "Boris?" I said, barely able to breathe. No response. Then I felt it, a shift in the air, a presence looming over me in the darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight with shaking hands, but before I could turn it on, Boris gasped awake with a deep, guttural breath. He shot up, nearly tearing the tent open. Something was in here. His voice was raw, panicked. I had never seen him afraid before. We scrambled out of the tent, gasping for fresh air. The fire had long since burned out, leaving us in complete darkness. But the woods were no longer silent. The footsteps were back, closer, surrounding us. Then we saw it. Just beyond the tree line, a tall, gaunt figure stood motionless. It was impossibly thin, its limbs elongated, its skin stretched tight over its bones like old leather. Its eyes, two hollow pits of blackness, were locked onto us. Boris cursed under his breath. "We need to leave, now." We grabbed our backpacks and started toward the trail, but the moment we moved, the figure took a step forward. The crunch of twigs beneath its feet sent a cold spike of terror through my chest. Then it grinned, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched far too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Then, in an inhumanly fast movement, it sprinted towards us. Boris shoved me forward. "Run!" We bolted through the trees, our flashlights swinging wildly as we navigated the dark terrain. The sound of its pursuit was deafening, branches snapping, heavy footsteps slamming against the ground. Despite his size, Boris was fast. He pulled me along as we ran, weaving through the trees, trying to lose it, but it was gaining. Then a blood-curdling scream ripped through the night. I turned my head. Boris was gone. I stumbled to a halt, wheeling around with the flashlight. Boris? I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes. Then all of a sudden I heard gunshots, followed by a horrific screech. I panicked and took a few steps back when I heard something coming towards me at a high speed. I was ready to start running when Boris appeared from the darkness. "Run!" swinging his arms while sprinting at full speed. Without saying a word, we ran straight towards the truck and got in as fast as we could. "I think I got him good," Boris said. I didn't even respond to him, for I was busy getting us out of there as fast as possible. When we finally got out of the woods, I took a big sigh. Boris looked at me with big eyes and said, "What the heck just happened?" Nobody ever believed our story, but we know what we saw. Camping has always been my escape. Just me, the wilderness, and the quiet hum of my metal detector. There's something peaceful about it. The isolation, the thrill of discovery. That's why I found myself deep in Black Hollow Forest, miles from the nearest road, setting up my tent as the sun dipped behind the trees. The forest was untouched, a perfect spot for treasure hunting. Old settlements had once been here, long abandoned, leaving behind the occasional coin, tool, or relic buried beneath the earth. I had no idea what I was about to uncover. As the fire crackled, I pulled out my detector and swept it across the clearing. The soft beep of iron scraps and old nails wasn't surprising, but then a strong signal, deep, solid, different. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my trowel and started digging. The soil was packed tight, resisting me as if it didn't want to be disturbed. After about 2 feet down, my fingers scraped against something hard, not metal, something smooth. I switched on my flashlight and peered into the hole. Teeth, a row of human teeth. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. My first thought was animal remains, maybe a hunter's buried kill. But as I brushed away more dirt, I saw the shape of a face staring back at me. A human face. My stomach twisted. I had been hoping to find old relics, not a grave. I should have stopped there. I should have walked away. But something made me keep digging. The body was fresh. The bones weren't old and brittle. They were still wrapped in decaying flesh and clothes. The smell hit me thick and rancid, making my head spin. And then I saw the hands. They weren't curled up like a corpse that had been laid to rest. They were clawing at the dirt, fingers bent and broken, as if whoever this was had tried to crawl their way out. My chest tightened. This person hadn't been buried. They had been alive when they went into the ground. Panic surged through me. I scrambled backward, kicking up dirt. I needed to call the police, get out of these woods. And then my metal detector beeped again, loud, urgent. I turned, scanning the area just beside the first grave. Another signal, another body, then another and another. 6 in total. My hands trembled. This wasn't some old burial site. Someone had been using these woods as a dumping ground. And recently, a sound echoed through the trees, a twig snapping. I froze. I wasn't alone. The fire cast flickering shadows through the trees, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest was silent. Too silent. Then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. I grabbed my metal detector like a weapon, scanning the trees. "Who's there?" My voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. No answer. Then a voice, low, amused. "You weren't supposed to find that." The breath in my lungs turned to ice. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my face, my boots slipping on the uneven ground. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. The footsteps followed, fast, gaining on me. Then, out of nowhere, a hand grabbed my wrist. I screamed, swinging wildly. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, but no one was there. The hand was gone. My pulse pounded in my ears. The air felt thick, suffocating. The only sound was the frantic heaving of my own breath. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of my firelight, still, motionless, watching. I knew then that I wouldn't make it back to camp. If I turned my back, if I blinked, I'd end up just like them, buried, forgotten. I did the only thing I could. I dropped everything and ran toward the road. I don't know how long I ran. Time didn't exist. The woods stretched on forever, an endless nightmare. But somehow, I made it. I stumbled onto the highway, collapsed onto the pavement, and screamed for help. The police found my camp the next morning, but the bodies? Gone. No graves, no signs of digging, nothing. They found my metal detector, my gear, my tent, but no evidence of what I saw. They didn't believe me. I left town after that, moved to the city, haven't gone camping since. I didn't even want my metal detector back.